Well, hi, Jill.
Hello, Brent. I'm so excited.
So this is another Brunch with Brent, and you have been wonderfully excited to be on. And so I should introduce you a little bit more. So I'm joined here today by Jill Bryant Ryniker. And Jill, I would love for you to just give us a little taste of what you do.
So I am a co-host on Linux Weekly Daily Wednesday with Linux Gamecast on the Linux Gamecast network. And I do game streams with them. And I'm also the community organizer, otherwise known as the Morale Czar. That's what they named me. And I do lots of podcasts, and I love joining in with Linux Unplugged. And
yeah, regular guest there. That's how we got to kind of meet for the first time.
Yeah, that was awesome. And the Friday stream, which I do miss.
Many of us do. Yeah, for sure.
And then I'm also I'm part of the Big Danny Linux community as well. And just was interviewed by Rocco, too.
I should also mention there's LinuxChix LA in there as well.
Oh, yes. Oh, very, very important. Yes.
I just want to point out that I gave a listen to your Linux Spotlight with Rocco, which came out very recently, and it was an amazing conversation. So I would encourage everyone to go give that a listen. It was I was laughing throughout. I was smiling. I learned a lot about you. So I'm going to try not to sort of repeat that, because I think it was a really great conversation everybody can enjoy. So I'm here, I think, with you and I. We're just going to dive into a whole bunch of other stuff informed by that. So one thing I want to start with, actually, is how come you have such a bright and wonderful personality that's so contagious? That's one of the things that just was immediately apparent to me. And it seems like you're always smiling, for those of the podcasts that have a little bit of video. And do you get that a lot? Like, people are just attracted to you for that energy? It seems like a really great gift.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I get that a lot. And I've just my glass has always been half full.
Yeah, that's such a nice way to look at the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about podcasting. So I know you've been doing it for a long time now. And so give me a little taste of how you first got into it and where you think it's going. And I know you wanted to mention Chris in there.
Yeah. So Chris Fisher, you're the one who inspired me to get into Linux podcasting. I had been wanting to do this for so long. I've had years of broadcasting experience. In fact, I did produce and DJ'd my own show for almost 16 years in my 20s.
Tell me more about that. That sounds really fascinating.
So I did it. It was what we call synth music or krautrock music, electronic music show, and because it's not the genre music that is typically heard here in the United States, but it's a very part of the European art scene and an experimental scene.
And how did you first get connected to that music then?
Well, I had been a listener for years on another radio show, and this is years ago in the 80s. And I started co-hosting on a radio show here in Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University on a show called Alien Air Music.
I love that title.
Yeah.
That's great.
Pat Murphy was the first to play that genre of music. And then I decided to do my own show where I played, different music than he did. Some of the same overlap, but different. And, there were also no ladies into this genre of music. Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting, because a lot of the musicians and artists who would contact me and send me music to play on my show thought I was a guy.
Interesting, eh?
Yeah, because Jill is Gil in, a lot of the European countries and Russian.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so they just assumed they were talking to a guy.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's maybe a strange advantage, actually, like a pen name of sorts. That's really funny.
Yeah. It was. In fact, I taught one of the artists from Russia. His name is Edward Artemiev. He's done quite a few soundtracks, and I got to talk to him on the phone, and he was asking, is Jill Bryant at the residence? And I think my dad answered the phone, and she's here. And I started talking, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, this is like a lady. This is a girl. I've been communicating with a girl."
That's funny.
Because it's like Linux and all my other hobbies and that I'm into. It's male dominant, and I'm just used to that.
Well, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that, actually, because women in tech is certainly a totally great thing, and I'm a huge, massive supporter of it. For those who have listened to the episode with Elle, there's a whole bunch on that topic.
Oh, yes.
There, which was really great. But has that felt discouraging at any points? Like, it sounds like in this music scene and also in the Linux scene, you're surrounded by a bunch of men, which of course it can be totally fine. But has there been some challenges there too?
There has, but it was in the beginning, like in the early years of Linux. I'd gone to a lug and didn't feel welcome.
Really?
And I was just not even. They didn't even acknowledge me.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah, I was going up to introduce myself and say who I am, and I didn't get acknowledged, and that was really, that really depressed me. And then I found out. It turned out that my brother had worked with the person who ran that particular lug and said, "Oh, he's a bad seed."
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It sounds like it wasn't about you. It was more about him.
No, I guess he's just like that to everyone. But all the people that were part of that community were really nice. I wore one of my first Linux shirts, which was User Bin Girl from ThinkGeek, years ago. And I wore that, and I got a lot of comments from the community there. But I felt like it was very standoffish.
That's too bad.
And my brother said, yeah, he was really hard to work with.
So that was one of your first experiences with that. But as far as I understand now, for instance, with like LinuxChix and things like that, there's a whole positive spin to it, right?
Yeah. And then after that, I went a couple years without, I've always been a huge Linux user and had been using it. And, I'd started using it in literally 93. So, and I wanted to get involved more in the community. And that was really sad, but things changed.
Yeah. So this users group, did you go that one time and then feel kind of turned off and not go again?
I did go again, and I still felt, I figured, well, let me give it another chance.
Good for you.
Yeah. And I still felt not comfortable.
So not your place then, not your kind of people.
Yeah. And, but then a few years later, I wanted to attend Scale, the Southern California Linux Expo, and purposely sought out the LinuxChix of Los Angeles because I know, they were like-minded ladies in the field. And I had seen their meetings posted on the internet and the articles about the different conventions and the LinuxChix that were in the Linux Journal, our favorite Linux journal, is gone now. But I knew I wanted to connect with them, and that was one of my main reasons for going to Scale. And that was Scale 5X. And the first place I went after I registered is the gentlemen, the workers there were nice. Then it was Gareth Grenaway and Elon Rabinovich. And Gareth actually directed me straight. He took me straight to the LinuxChix LA booth. And I would have gone to Scale the previous couple of years, but I was a little nervous. I thought, well, maybe I'm not as good enough in Linux, Did
you feel like you might have had that same initial experience then?
Yes, and there was a little bit of that too. I felt a little nervous about that. But it was the exact opposite. I went to the booth and they had a questionnaire on what apps you use on Linux, and I named all my favorites. Of course, the GIMP and Inkscape then, and Blender, and Xterm, everything.
So it sounds like you're well versed for sure.
Yeah, I wrote down like literally like 50 apps I use, and then my favorite window managers.
You put an S on that, which I love.
Window Maker, Flexbox, OpenBox, TWM, the whole 9 yards. And they were just kind of blown away. They're like, "Oh my gosh, you know all the stuff. You've been using Linux for so many years."
Well, and that's what I love is like there's many of us who are just kind of like, before we get introduced to the community, the greater community, there's a lot of us doing some cool stuff kind of just in the shadows a little bit, right? And I think for you and I now, it's our job to kind of invite them out and say, hey, come on out here. Like, it's pretty friendly out here. So, but please continue the LinuxChix story. That's great.
Yeah. So what was so amazing? It was one of the best days, honestly, of my life, going to that first day at Scale.
Wow, that is huge.
And then going to the LinuxChix booth, and within literally 20 minutes, they're like, they just gave me hugs, and it was exact opposite of what I experienced before in the whole Scale community. It was just if you're a Linux user, you got a hug. And they're just inviting me, and I'm like, oh, come behind the booth, Jill. And then I started helping them with their booth, and we were best friends forever from that point on.
Wow, that sounds like a really powerful experience for you.
It was, and that was early 2000s. So,
and so you were a big Linux fan before going there, but I imagine having this experience, you were just a fan for life after that.
All of a sudden, I was part of the community, and that's what did. It was my Scale family and my LinuxChix LA family.
That's awesome. And that family continues up to today. Like, you're still quite a bit involved. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yes. So it didn't take just literally that day, and they made me, Sharon's like, she was the president at the time, and within a few days, she's like, Jill, you're now a co-organizer of the LinuxChix Los Angeles.
Wow, that's awesome. Ole.
So there's 3 of us that are co-organizers. So it's an amazing organization, basically to help get not only ladies into Linux and diversity in Linux, but men also. We were not gender exclusive. So we have just as many men in our group as women.
Which is great. I really applaud that sentiment of trying to be inclusive to everyone, and not necessarily leaving anybody out, right? I think that's super important, even if you come at it from sort of a different angle. So yeah, kudos to you guys. That's really important work. I think that's great.
In fact, at our meetups, we do hands-on workshops teaching how to install Linux on Raspberry Pis and on computers. And we encourage, new users, of anyone to come. And usually we have more men than women, but that's kind of normal. So there's just more men getting into it than women. So.
And how do you think, for yourself, what led you to being just hooked on computers? Because I know from what I've learned recently that you have a number of them behind you and all of that stuff. But I know you had a brother who was interested in it. And what was this, an older brother?
Yes. He's 4 years older. His name is Jack. So it's Jack and Jill. Yes.
Oh, interesting. I have an older brother named Chris, who's 4 years older, who got me into computers. So that's really similar, actually.
Oh, that's awesome, Brent. We have something in common.
We have tons in common.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, we have everything. So much in tech.
And so I imagine Jack had a huge influence on you.
Yes, definitely. He was one of the first people to get into IT in the 80s, and that was before most people even had computers at home. So, and we had just about everything at home. And he had elite BBS. It was truly elite. In fact, he ended up getting jobs working directly with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs because of that BBS.
Yeah, wow, that sounds amazing. And your grandparents too had some kind of connection there as well, right?
Yes, Apollo. Yeah, they were because here I live in the middle. That's why I grew up here, is because of aerospace. You know, we have JPL and SpaceX and Northrop Grumman, and which was TRW and International Rectifier and all the big. This is the think tank area where a lot of the products are made that go into space.
That sounds so fascinating. I want to know so much more.
My grandparents were both top, secret with Apollo. So I grew up with that. And my grandmother both built tubes for the very first computers. So it's just been part of my family.
Right. So how could you not be influenced by that? Yeah, it sounds like there's a real trade of that being handed down throughout your family. So that's a kind of an amazing history, actually.
Yeah, I'm very, very proud of it. Give you a little bit. My grandmother was the one who built the engine that brought Apollo 13 home.
Oh, man.
That was her engine. It wasn't intended. It was intended for the LEM, not to bring them home, but it had enough power and was built so well that it could bring them back to Earth.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
She got a medal from the president and everything for that. So
that's so cool. Wow.
Yeah.
I just got to pause for a moment. It sounds to me, so you started at a very young age being interested in computers then, and so that has brought you all the way to today, where that hasn't given up in any way, it seems like, right? You seem like a tinkerer at heart, and just a voracious learner for sure.
Yeah. And, my brother always says, well, it wasn't just that we had it around in the house and you had access. You wanted to do it. You had the drive to learn how to build computers. I took our Apple II apart, which much to my parents' chagrin.
As long as you put it back together, right?
I put it back together and got it working. And then the first computer I really built was my 286. And I did animation on it, and led to my becoming an animator later in life.
So I want to dive into that a little bit, because I think, as you know, I'm a photographer and I do all my stuff on Linux. And Cheese does some design work, some of it on Linux. And so I want to jump in a little bit about sort of how you feel about the creative community using Linux, because as far as I understand, that's a relatively new thing. Of course, you're maybe a bit of an exception to that, but give me a little bit of your perspective on that.
Well, originally in the 80s, I was using a PC at home to do animation because I couldn't afford the, $50,000 Unix.
Of course. Yeah, right.
And the, software that they were using for animation at the time. So the industry, honestly, is particularly with film, not so much broadcast TV, which is still predominantly, Mac and Windows, but still Linux on the back end for rendering. But the film industry really, they just moved directly from Unix to Linux. And one of the pieces of software that brought about that change was Maya. Originally, it was Alias Wavefront for Unix, and then it moved over to Linux. And as soon as that started happening, all the softwares, proprietary and open source, started moving to Linux, not just for rendering, but for creative content.
Do you have any idea what was the original impetus for them to make that switch?
Price, cost. Because in the film, in TV, they actually have more money to spend on their productions. In film, they have like a 2-year span and they can only spend a certain amount. And that's what it was. It was the ability to have not just free software, but maybe even more important to that, to be able to develop the software that they wanted, with an open operating system. So they can add, like, for instance, Pixar and Disney, they have software they developed under Linux just for doing like underwater scenes and Finding Dory and Finding Nemo. And all that development was, done on Linux. They use Maya and Blender and a lot of different software packages together, as well as proprietary. But Disney is in the process. They've been open sourcing a lot of their animation software. And what was really cool is recently, Actually, 2 years ago at SIGGRAPH, the big international computer animation convention, someone in the audience had asked one of the developers of the software they were using for Finding Nemo if it was going to come to Windows. And they said, we don't need to bother. We're using Linux. And I was just like, yay!
That's so awesome.
and they even had System 76 laptops on stage. It was awesome.
That makes me smile because that's exactly how I feel about it, right? It's like, why would we translate the software to Windows when that feels like a downgrade, right?
Yeah.
And that Linux is available to everyone.
And then another thing is with recently, it's just over a year old, the Academy Software Foundation has been incredible because it's helping all these companies and businesses who want to start using open source software, not with just usability, but the licenses and everything they need. And it's specifically made for Hollywood. And, Blender was the forefront of that movement back in the early 2000s. I've been using it since then. So
do you have any personal experience with that foundation then?
No, but I am thinking of becoming a little bit more involved. And I did get to talk to the executive producer at the Open Source Summit recently in San Diego. There was a long line of people to talk to him after he did a talk talking about doing an introduction about the Academy Software Foundation and what it's doing in the industry. It was a learning tutorial for new people who didn't know. And so most of the people that were in line were young students who want to get in the animation industry. So I came up to him. I was the last person to talk to him. And I said, oh, no, I'm a podcaster. And I've been talking about the Academy Software Foundation since the beginning. I do a Linux news podcast. And I said, I've been working in the industry for years. The companies I work for, we've had, multiple awards, everything from Webbies and Tellies to Emmys. And I've been in it for many years. and he was just like, oh, Jill, I want to talk to you. He was so excited to talk to someone that was in the field, at the Linux convention.
Yeah, instead of necessarily just students.
Yeah.
And so did you guys go for coffee or something, or did you keep chatting?
No, he had to take a plane home.
Time constraints, that's always the challenge.
Yeah. But he talked with me a good half hour. We had a nice chat.
That must have been great.
Yeah. So that was really nice. And I got to tell him, my experience and how it's changed. It's, not just Linux on the back end anymore. It's in the development and creative now. So
on the front end.
Yeah, on the front end.
Which is so nice to hear. Like, from my perspective with photography, we're using similar tools, but a little bit different. And so I've watched, even in the last, I guess it's almost 8, 9, 10 years, something like that. I've watched the software grow quite a bit and enable many of us to do it full time with the tools that are available in open source, as opposed to the commercial stuff. And so it sounds like the transition that animation and film made many years ago seems to be just happening now.
It's so true. Now the graphics arts just and photography, it's really starting to come of age now. So that's been really awesome.
Of course, I'm biased, but that's very exciting. And I hope it can reach as wide an audience as it has in your world, really. Yeah,
I think I definitely know it will. I mean, you've got, programs like Darktable that are really, taken off. And then you have, Krita and GIMP and Photopea and all the open source software that you can use now in Inkscape under Linux. That's really, taking over. And now we also have the proprietary, we have DaVinci Resolve, which has taken over the Adobe suite in the industry because it's, it's Premiere and After Effects all in one.
You mentioned something that I want to go back to for a slight moment. You mentioned during your experience in film, you worked with a whole bunch of businesses that got a whole bunch of awards. Can you tell me a little bit more about that time in your life?
Yeah, no problem. So it was after I graduated. I was the very first computer animation graduate from the Cal State system. I was what was called a special major. I created my own. I combined communications, fine arts, and computer science.
Oh, cool. That's such a great combination.
Yeah. And, it took a year to get it approved, but they were all so impressed. Like, this is the future. This is, back then we called it the information superhighway, the future of,
right.
of the creativity. Yeah. So that was, in fact, I had to do a talk in front of the director of the Cal State system. And that was the big term, was the information superhighway was going to bring, creativity to a new level.
And has it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah,
we don't
right.
call it the information superhighway anymore.
Right. Things have changed.
Things have changed. But yeah, so I had created my own major. So what had happened is after I graduated, I was a nervous student, wanted to get into the field, but I'd already had worked most of my life doing animation, all back, to the Apple II when I was a little kid. And, worked really, really hard. And then I got connected with a freelance animator and who had a studio and did quite a bit of work for him starting in the mid 90s and on. And he had contracts, actually, because we worked together for quite a few years, and we had contracts with Fox and Warner Brothers, Disney, ESPN, Electronic Arts. And so one of the first pieces I worked on, my very first animation, was, of all things, a commercial for the Russian hockey team that was going to be viewed on ESPN. So whenever they traveled, and they were, one of the top teams at the time, so wherever they traveled, the commercial ran. And I saw it for like 5 years after I had done it.
That's funny.
That got nominated for an Emmy.
Wow. That must feel pretty good.
Oh, God. My very first piece I had ever done for the industry gets nominated for an Emmy. And Kevin, my other animator, we worked together. He's like, Jill, he goes, your career is set. You have Emmy on your resume. It's like Emmy, just even being nominated. Because at the time it was 1998, and that was the first year that a commercial that was all computer graphics was one of the topics for nomination. So the first CG commercial. And so that was a big deal. And there were, like over 500 submissions. And that was a big deal.
Does that feel a bit surreal at this point, like revisiting that?
Yes. Yeah. I watch it and I said, oh, gosh, it looks so amateur. But at the time, it was high tech,
Yep.
And that actually, the other significant thing about that piece is one of the reasons that the studios give freelancers their work is that they don't have time to do it in-house. And so you have a major deadline. We were staying up for days without sleep to get it rendered, and which can take time. So after you create it, then you have to have time to render it. Well, we didn't have enough power to make that final render, to get it to them in 2 days. So I actually stayed up all night that first night. As I created my animation I needed to, and my modeling, and I stayed up all that night and built another computer, which was a 486 at the time, so I could render. So I'd have 3 computers I could render with at home. And then that started my render farm, which later grew into a Pentium, dual processor Pentium Pro to quad processor Xeons and DEC Alphas and the whole 9 yards. But yeah, and what was really neat is he told the company, he goes, my animator built an extra computer just so that we can get this job done.
Wow, that's dedication, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
There's something about having a need that just drives you.
Yeah. So I did that piece, and then they've got like 20 tellies and webbies, and then an Emmy in the future. But that was kind of what launched that. And I could tell you one other project I'm really proud of.
Sure, please do.
Gosh.
Put it out into the world.
I know.
Sounds great.
Oh my God, this is so. Oh my God, I'm telling the world
You don't have to.
No, but this is it's time because this was very special. Yeah, so we actually ended up doing the editing on the trailer for The Perfect Storm.
Right, which many of us probably have seen.
Yes, and most people have seen it. So a lot of people have seen my work. But the really cool thing is we worked really hard, not just on the editing, but we created our own effects for that final wave scene because we didn't like what the studio gave us, and we didn't think it looked kind of real enough. So then at the time, the studio's water and what we call caustics has always been hard to render. And we didn't, there was no one piece of software that did water really, really well. It would do the mass, like an ocean mass or a mass or a lake, but it was not good at doing splashes and waves.
Where there's a lot of different details and reflections and all that movement, yeah.
Exactly. And studios were able to do a lot of that, but they achieved that with, really like hundreds of people, trying to get this right. And it was just me and one other animator.
So not as many resources?
Not as many resources. And darn it. And one reason I wanted to bring this project up is because, darn it, I wish we had open source software then. So this is, 2000 and we just didn't have that. So we had to combine, I combined some effects from 3D Studio, release R4 for DOS. This is before, I did that on Windows. And Lightwave. We had some Maya in there, and I had to write a script that would go from one program to another to get the effects that we needed, because one program would have the part of the effect and the other program would have the other. So to make the splash look real, we had to use several different programs of different particle systems from different programs, and then I would script it, and we added chaos to it, and that ended up on the final splash of the wave. And the big deal there was that the studio was so blown away with what we had done that's what was part of the original film.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah. So it became, so that was one of the first films that we had worked on.
Oh, that's unbelievable. Instead of just a commercial, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. You must feel super proud about putting that work in and then having it be recognized.
Yeah. And it was a lot of, it was so much just thinking about it. I remember, going to Kevin's house and we were, just, pounding our heads, like, how are we going to achieve this? It was just because we didn't, the tools weren't available and we didn't have access to those at home, in our own studios, like Warner Brothers did and Pixar, So, but then we were able to do something that they were having a hard time achieving. So that was a proud.
So 2 people beat 100 people.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Good for you. And thank you for sharing that story. That's amazing. That's really amazing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm sharing it on the internet. Cool.
Now it's out there.
It's so funny because that's what's unique also about podcasting. I've been behind the scenes most of my life, except for, doing my teaching computer animation and motion graphics with my students. And they've seen, as instructors show the students our work after they've been taking the class a while so they can see what you can do, and it helps them get them inspired. But I've never put this out really on the internet too much, except talking with Ven and Pedro on LWW in the pre-show and after show with our patrons and chat. So I've shared some with them, but not in an interview or a chat.
Well, thank you for sharing it. I feel like a lot of people are going to love that story. So that sounds amazing. How do you think that open source would have changed that story a little bit?
Oh boy. Well, I could have had tools more like Blender at that time. we could have hired a software developer to, help us do these special particle systems,
So you feel like it would have made it easier than trying to daisy chain and pull like little pieces from all these different tools and have them create the effect that you needed, right?
And now, a lot of the freelancers that are left do have a lot of developers, because in the animation industry, half of it is, we need coders and developers to create the software needed.
Well, I love the juxtaposition between technical creativity, which would be the developers who are trying to achieve a vision, and the actual, like the visual creativity as well, and how those two now these days are such a cool place that technical people who traditionally haven't been seen as creative can really show their creativity in many ways. Right?
Yes, definitely. And yeah, as you know, it's just as much technical as it is creative and artistic. And especially in the freelance world, where you've got to know everything. You got to be a jack of all trades.
Or a Jill of all trades.
Yeah. And I encourage that in my students, because a lot of times, they want to be character animators or do textures or do sound or do lighting. And I try and give them as broad experience. I, want them to create their own movies with all these elements together. So they get to learn a little bit of everything, so they can see what emphasis they would like to, what area they'd like to focus on, but also so that they're well-rounded for the industry. Because I want my students, I want them to not just learn character animation. A lot of the other schools, that's what they just churn out students learning, character or materials, but they don't focus on the whole person and the whole, area of knowledge. And I even not only, of course, teach them Linux, but also I always do a session on how to build a computer, because that has helped me, and it's good for them to know how it all works.
And do you feel like the students are responsive to that these days?
Oh, yes. They're coming to me knowing that this is the field they want to get into. Most, like half my students want to get into the field. So they're willing to learn, and they understand that they need to know a lot of this to be relevant in the industry. And so they not only coming in with that art background, with life drawing and years of drawing and painting and sculpting and color theory and computer graphics with Photoshop or GIMP or Inkscape and all those skills, but they also need to know the technical. Very important.
Well, and I totally associate with your giving them like a rounded view of the industry and then allowing them to jump into a niche, because I feel like the same is true with podcasting, right? Is that if you know all of the pieces that go into sort of the whole pipeline, then you have this perspective that even if you're only working on a little piece of it, you have this perspective that makes your work sort of fit in a different way, or allows you to solve different puzzles, right? With that creativity.
Exactly. Solve different problems. You realize, okay, well, I'm working on, like, if they're doing materials, I'm working on this material. Well, how can I help the people that are animating these materials?
So thinking of the impact later on in the process. Oh, that's really fascinating.
That's always been a goal, is to make sure they're really well-rounded, and that also that they have learned to have a really good work ethic, because the hours are grueling. So can be grueling.
Well, in anything you love, it is. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, in anything you love. Yeah, whatever you're doing.
The cool thing I've noticed is when you're working on something so passionately, you kind of forget about time, and you forget about, that staying up all night is kind of crazy, right?
Yes, it's happening to me right now with podcasting.
Oh, really? In what way?
Well, just doing all the research for it. I try and get to bed at a halfway decent time, but ended up staying up sometimes till 2 and 3 in the morning, reading Linux news stories for my show, and listening to all the podcasts, because I love all the Linux podcasts, and I listen to them all.
Pretty soon there's going to be too much content for you to possibly take in, right?
Yeah. And it's already kind of coming to that, because there's new shows coming out, and I'm just like, I can't keep it all up. But I try to.
You can just play it while you're sleeping. I've heard it gets in your brain anyways.
And I just love it. I'm just living it. In fact, I'm not doing much watching other content than YouTubers and Twitch streamers and podcasts. It's been pretty much my life because I've just loved it and just going, putting myself all into it. And I love it. I love all the communities.
Does that feel like a big treat for you now? How when you were first starting, maybe the community or Linux wasn't spoken as publicly, and that now it's sort of everywhere?
Yes, we have bloomed. The flower has, spread forth. Yeah.
It's about time.
And this is what we've needed. For me, it's a continuation of the community we have at Scale and the Linux conventions and the lugs. This is a continuation of that. The podcasting is, online lugs, like Linux Unplugged, one of my favorite shows.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the Linux Unplugged, I think, as I've mentioned before, is the reason I'm even here. And it sounds like that was a huge impact for you as well.
I started watching Jupiter Broadcasting in the beginning since it was the computer action show and not the Linux action before it was the Linux action show. And I was listening to Jupiter at night and stoked. And I'd always wanted to become involved in the Jupiter Broadcasting community. But at the time I was really busy with my, my animation career and I already had so many hobbies.
I've heard you have a few.
Yeah, including collecting vintage computers. I have several hundred. So when I started podcasting with Linux Gamecast, and I knew that was the community I wanted to start with because that's the one I became friends with everyone, and because it had a graphics end to it. It was Linux Gamecast. It was gaming on Linux. And I had done some work in the field. I'd worked as I mentioned earlier, a little bit for actually a lot for Electronic Arts, doing game development and 3D models and artwork. So, and Linux Gamecast, Linux gaming was my passion. And this is, the days before Steam, before we had Proton and all that. After I started with Linux Gamecast, I've been full-time with them now a year and a half. And I knew it was time to start giving back to the Jupiter Broadcasting community because of all the wonderful Linux content that Chris has worked so hard and all of you work so hard, and who he has given us so much in the Linux community and over the years. And I just wanted to give back. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to get involved in Jupiter Broadcasting. So I wanted to help give back to the community that Chris worked so hard to create. And just it's my thank you to him.
Wow. Well, I'm sure he'll listen to this, and I'm sure that means a heck of a lot to him for sure. And it does to me as well as purely a member of the Jupiter Broadcasting community. I feel like, if we all have gained so much from it and continue to gain so much from it, and it's that giving back somehow, whether it's just coming to say hi at a conference or something like that, all of those little gestures make a huge difference, right? And of course, you've showed up quite a bit in the Mumble room when we're doing Linux Unplugged on a weekly basis live, which anybody can join, and it's been so nice to have someone like you there, because it just it adds to the diversity of all the people that are included in that group, right? And I know you and I, sometimes after the show, we just end up just chatting for no reason and just having a really good time.
Oh, I love all you guys. You, Brent, and Cheese Bacon, and Wes, and Joe. You all, everyone in the Jupiter Broadcasting community, and Elle. I love Elle. I was so happy to see another lady in Linux podcasting after I started. I'm like, oh, good. Chris has Elle now. Yay.
Yeah, for sure. And Angela, I think she's been behind the scenes, which is kind of a thing you mentioned, right? Like there's a lot of people behind the scenes that don't always get seen.
Yeah, and I loved her Woman in Tech podcast she was doing and the faux show. And yeah, Angela has been amazing driving force in Jupiter Broadcasting. So I've always looked up to her too, a lot.
That's great. And You mentioned some of the earlier shows. It sounds like you know more about the history of Jupiter Broadcasting than I do in many ways, because I came to it a little bit later.
I just a ravenous listener, you know. I was so quiet, other than, I donated, and, I've been a patron of Jupiter Broadcasting since the very beginning, but I've been, I was buying the t-shirts, and I have the challenge coin, and
Wow. You're outdoing a lot of us, I think.
yeah, and so I wanted to give back, and also because Ven Stone, the producer of Linux Gamecast, got his start because of Jupiter Broadcasting.
Oh, cool. I'm learning all of these things. Is really cool.
Yeah.
I like the idea that, there are a lot of communities now, and you're part of a lot of them.
Yes.
And that we all have our, concentrated time. It's like, okay, Tuesdays at whatever time it is in your local time, there's Linux Unplugged. And then you can bounce to another one somewhere else that has a bit of a different crew and some overlapping community members too, and go be a part of that community as well, right?
I just love that.
I think you're totally going to agree with me in that it's really special how it's okay to be a part of all of them.
Yes.
And that there are all these connections that happen between all of them, like a web of really neat interconnections, right? And that we all grow because of it.
Yeah, we all grow and we all learn, different points of view. Like, for instance, I'm doing, LWDW is a Linux news show. Well, of course, Jupiter Broadcasting has lots of Linux news shows, including Linux Unplugged and Linux Action News and all the other shows. But we all cover different things. We have our uniquenesses and the way, as in not in just the stories, but in how we produce them and how we talk about them. So we all learn from each other. We all share knowledge. We're sharing knowledge.
Yeah, which is that's open source, right? Is sharing all of it.
Exactly.
I appreciate in the podcast that there's different perspectives and different ways of presenting the information. Like, as you know, as a teacher, not everybody learns the same and not everybody connects with information in the same way, right? So to have it be presented in all these different ways is a huge asset, and kudos to open source for keeping that spirit of sharing and collaboration, right?
That's what's just so amazing. I love. We've spread that to the internet, the Linux community, and all their, used to be, these quiet lugs and conferences are now spreading that love online.
It's spreading everywhere. It's awesome. Tell me a little bit more about some of the other conferences, because you mentioned Scale, but it sounds like you bounce around a little bit more too.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, I want to go to Linux Fest Northwest because it's the next big one that I haven't been to yet that I've been wanting to go.
It's amazing. I'm totally biased because that was my first experience with conferences, but
yes,
it would be great to see you there.
Oh, I'd love to go. So I'm going to work on that. But we've been having here in Los Angeles quite a few open source summit conferences as well, which are fun. They're not quite as community based, but they're growing a little bit more in that way. But it's more big business. But I go for the hallway track, so
it's the best place to be.
It's the best part of a convention, anyways. Really. The talks are wonderful. Expo Hall is incredible, but it's those connections that you make in the hallway track that I love.
That's what's really memorable, I find.
Yeah.
Tell me, I'm interested a little bit more in some of your teaching. Because you mentioned it sort of in some of your stories. It was some key aspects in some of your stories. But what inspired you to move from kind of being the professional doing stuff behind the scenes to sharing that knowledge?
You know what? I always was. I actually started out in the 90s as a tutor in the animation department. And then I went to TA and then ended up being on the board of directors for the department. and so I had always been doing that through my college years. And that helped me get a lot of connections, actually, because I was doing that and had that experience. That helped me with my work experience, getting into freelance work. So yeah, I ended up doing the teaching first.
Yeah, and then it both existed at the same time. And I feel like that's the real gift of a teacher. Sometimes you see, and maybe now I'm starting to speak about my personal experience, but sometimes you see teachers who were in the industry and either have retired or decide to get out for some reason, and they teach, and they don't always have the same perspective as someone who's working in it alongside the teaching, right? And so I really appreciate how you were kind of doing both, and that's the best benefit for the students, right? Is that you're teaching them exactly what's happening in the industry today.
And I get that actually from my students, because they, know a lot of their other instructors, used to do their profession, and they're now just teaching. And so my students are always amazed, and you're still doing this, and they're thrilled that I'm doing podcasting too. And they like that I'm what we call it Twitch tuber. And they're like, cool, my teacher is a Twitch streamer, It's like, but yeah, just being able to share that enthusiasm with them and all the areas that I love, and then I'm still continuing to do work, and just love that.
You're giving back to the community in so many different ways, from teaching to some of the podcast stuff that you're doing, and even just showing up at conferences and LinuxChix. And so thank you, I will say, from the community for your big heart and your giving back. It's really meaningful.
Oh, it's been an honor to do it. It really has. This community is amazing.
Yeah, and it's growing, and it's continuing to be even more amazing, which is such a treat.
And what's really been just really exciting for me is a lot of my students who end up getting work in the industry and becoming, producers and animators and whatnot are part of the Linux community now and part of the LinuxChix.
You're seeing them evolve in your footsteps almost, right?
Yeah. In fact, they call themselves Jill Cyples.
That's awesome. You have a following.
Yeah. So it's so funny because at Scale, when I was introducing all the Linux Gamecast, all our hosts to a lot of people at Scale, they're like, oh, is another student, another former student? Yay, bringing them in.
Well, that must mean you're doing some good work.
Yeah.
That's good feedback. I want to say thank you so much for chatting. I know you and I will continue to have these kind of conversations, and maybe we can share some of them in the future as well. But thank you so much for your time, and this was really, really fun.
Thank you so much for having me, Brent. This is an honor. And I can actually say, it's kind of a dream come true. I've always wanted to get involved in Jupiter Broadcasting. So,
well, here you are. Thank you so much for being involved in many ways. Is there anywhere that you'd like to send people if they want to get connected with you or just hear you giggle or those kind of things?
So I got several places. One is at Twitter at Jill_LinuxGirl, and at Mastodon at Jill_LinuxGirl at mast.linuxgamecast.com. And on email, it's Jill@linuxgamecast.com.
I wondered if you had an ask of the community, either like something you'd like them to do or explore or try.
Yes, so I actually have two things.
Okay, great. Bring it on.
One is a current news story that's been happening. Please help support the GNOME Foundation in fighting the Shotwell image app patent troll, and help send a message to patent trolls everywhere that they should never target free software. This is scary. This can be very scary, especially it's Rothschild that's behind it, and it's not good. The
implications are huge, right? And so if we can kind of get together and make a difference, I think that speaks volumes.
Yeah, and I had donated the first day I found out about it immediately, and if you can't donate monetarily, just spread the word on social media and on the internet. All it takes is one person to spread the word, and 100 people will hear it and see it, and they may contribute. So we got to help them.
Yeah. So let's get everyone's eyes on it for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing is there are so many wonderful Linux podcasts and videocasts out there, whether it be an RSS feed, on YouTube, on Twitch, or all three, like we've been talking about. I encourage everyone to go find and watch them. You never know what amazing communities you will discover and learn from, and you just might become one of the contributing members yourself.
Which has happened to both you and I, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Members of the community, and then you get a little closer, and all of a sudden one day you find yourself in the chair. So I agree completely.
Yay, Brent.
Yay, Jill. If you can show up, if it's at a conference, if it's at Scale, if it's at Linux Fest Northwest or any other conference that catches your attention.
Yeah, get involved.
For sure. Even in the online communities, there's all these Telegram groups.
Yeah, and meetups.
Yeah, and live podcasts that get recorded every week. So just show up. You never know what's going to happen. Well, thanks, Jill. I hope to connect with you really soon. And thank you so much for your time and for connecting. This was really fun.
Thank you, Brent, so much. You're one of my favorite people in the community. And I can't wait to give you a hug when I see you in real life.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we did just figure out that we're both going to be at this coming Scale.
Yeah. Yay.
Can you remind some of us when that is coming up?
Yeah, so it'll be March 5th through 8th of 2020. Scale 18X. Amazing.
That sounds great. I think, in for a treat. It's going to be my first Scale experience. So.
Oh, I'm so excited.
And I really look forward to meeting you there in person, too. That's going to be great.
Yay.
Thanks, Jill.
Thank you so much, Brent. Love you, community. Love everyone.
Yes, lots of love to the community. Thanks, everyone.